Anyways, welcome, Brocifer.
Hello.
Greetings.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. Just is the proper way to address you? Is it Rabbi Asher? Is that
Yeah, it's fine.
gotcha? All right. Cool. Yeah. So I would just love to kind of ask you a little bit about Judaism. I'm just for a little bit of background on me. I am probably would describe me as an atheist. I don't really identify with that title so much, but that's where I think categorically people would put me, just because I don't have a particular belief in any one specific God. But one of the things that I always get hung up on.
What do you identify as? I'm sorry. I don't
I
want to
don't
call
know. I don't know. Maybe agnostic. I think that the actual act of knowing, I think, is it's really hard for anybody to truly know. Even when you talk to people of faith, and we try and distill or drill down to how do we know something, it often comes down to, well, it's not about knowing, it's about faith. It's about taking a step of faith and believing in something that you don't know entirely. And so I think I know even agnostic can have a really charged meaning depending on who you're talking to, but I think that truly, I think that part of the human experience is not knowing. Whether that means that a God exists or that a God doesn't exist, I think that's the most honest that I could describe my belief system as.
I completely agree with you.
Yeah.
I think the healthiest approach. Yeah, go ahead, Moshe. What you say?
I was going to say, I respect that man because he's willing to be intellectually honest and say what he really believes.
Okay. So I feel that if a thinking religious person is going to be honest, he should properly identify as an optimistic agnostic versus a pessimistic agnostic. While a pessimistic agnostic is essentially what people call an atheist, although with the term alone, atheist just means no God. So it's more of a radicalized agnostic. So I personally identify as an optimistic agnostic. I can't prove that God exists. I don't think people could prove he can exist. I don't think people could prove that he cannot exist, which means it's essentially a washout. All we have is evidence. There's evidence for God's non-existence and there's evidence for God's existence. So I think what we should be trying to discuss is the necessity of a good God in people's lives and how it affects their behavior and society for essentially the good and in some cases the bad. And that's really what we should strive to weigh out. I think that people who submit themselves to the standards that appear in the Jewish Bible essentially live richer, fuller lives in the vast majority of cases. While people who strive to reinvent the wheel ethically typically don't. There are many cases where you will find religious people who are crappy and atheists who are ethically striving, but I think that in the vast majority of cases, it benefits this planet to have more people submitting themselves at least to the ethics that appear in the Jewish Bible than not.
Okay. Can I ask, is that the basis for believing in the Jewish Bible then, as kind of a pragmatic, this leads to a better life? Or is there some, because one of the things I've struggled with is I've chatted with, because I hop on sometimes to different lives with Christians and Muslims and atheists sometimes, and I sometimes push back on atheists, I mean, just depending on who I'm talking to, but specifically in the religious realm, one of the things I struggle with is when people say hey, Jesus is God, or Allah is God, or whatever particular God a person follows. I go, okay, but how do we know? And oftentimes people go back to the evidence of, they say, well, look, it's such a complex world that there's no way it could have been created without a God. And I go, even if, okay, I say, I don't agree. I think it's possible that complexity could exist outside of God, but let's say I grant you that. Let's say that complexity is impossible without the existence of a God. How do we then make the leap from there must be a God to God is Jesus, or God is, Allah, or God is the God of the Old Testament, or maybe God is just some cosmic child with a giant petri dish who has put us together for a science project and doesn't care about us one way or the other? How do we know the nature of God?
Mm-hmm.
Simply because we know that the world is complex. Does that make sense?
So this is why when someone tells me they believe in God, it doesn't tell me anything about that person. It depends what God they believe in, right? I think that the reason we believe in God is not because God declares himself to be God, but specifically because of the Bible. Like in our case, the Jewish Bible. We believe in God because of the Bible. We don't believe in the Bible because of God. Meaning,
Can you say that one more time? Sorry, you believe in
we believe in God because of the Bible. We don't believe in the Bible because of God.
Got it.
So
Okay.
once this Bible has demonstrated to be more of an ethical net gain than a net loss on this planet, this in some way makes his behavior something to strive through. His standard is, it seems, throughout history, that it doesn't help just some men, but almost all men or all societies. In the vast majority of cases, there are clearly examples that those people I wish were atheists, people who misuse the Bible to oppress people and this and that. But I think the West in particular is a good example that the Bible has been an ethical net gain rather than a net loss. So I don't think it's important to just say that God is God and my religion is true. I take more of a deistic approach. However, the vast majority of Jews, Christians, and Muslims do not. They in some way try to convert people to their religion on the basis of these philosophical arguments of their God being omniscient, omnipotent, all these things that are not so concrete in the Bible, just because there's some instance that he seems to be omniscient, and there are other instances that show not. So all we can really use to defend religion is pragmatism, right? What ultimately works. What's the utilitarian purpose of religion, and particularly the Jewish or Christian or Islamic religions, i.e. the three major monotheistic religions? And I think that it lays down an ethical code that gets man to challenge his carnal nature. And I think that's always a good thing. The Jewish God has been able to espouse ethics in the most consistent way possible. I'm not saying perfect. I'm not saying believe in my Bible because it's true and because it's perfect. No. In life, the choice is typically not between what's horrific and what's utopian, but between what's good and what's better. I think a religious existence is a lot better than an atheistical one. Not just for us, but specifically for our kids, to give them some sort of push forward in life. The idea that children should try to figure everything out on their own and should really start life with some sort of nihilistic pursuit that they're like a piece of cosmic garbage and there's no purpose, is, I think, not equipping them for success. I think it's important for us to... Yep, go ahead.
Sorry. Can I just ask you about? I just wanted to ask for some clarification on something you mentioned there. So you'd mentioned kind of a pragmatic, a pragmatic reason for believing in God. Does it necessitate? Is it necessary in your mind for the entity of God to exist in actuality, or would it be sufficient in your mind for maybe these are sort of like, I hate to use the word fairy tales because I'm not trying to use this as I'm not trying to use that as a pejorative, but these are essentially more folk tales or stories that are passed down. Like, does the belief in God for you necessitate the actual existence of that being, or is it enough for you to say like, hey, we believe these things, we follow these things for that pragmatic purpose?
So this is why I said that belief is secondary. I mean, if someone tells me they believe in God, it tells me nothing about their behavior. If they obey the ethical precepts that appear in that Bible, that tells me a lot about the person. And specifically what religion they're actually practicing. Like if it's completely faith-based, it means that your heart is going to decide what's right and wrong at any given situation. This is why I say that we believe in God because of the Bible. We don't believe in the Bible because of God. Meaning, it's true. The possibility of God not existing at all, right? But these instructions actually making society better, especially at the time that they appeared on the scene, when people behaved worse than animals, right? Gods at that time behaved worse than people. I mean, society would still flourish, even though this, let's say, would have been a fairy tale. However, we have to ask ourselves, what really makes the Bible supernatural? Mainly that it was an ethical system that at the time that it appeared was head and shoulders compared to the other systems like the Book of the Dead, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and there were many ethical ideas within those books as well, but it seems that the Bible introduced this notion of consistent ethics. It essentially just means it was more ethical than the rest, and it was enough to civilize this planet. And it seems that that is enough to get it in some way penned by a good God. God is not God if he's not good, essentially. And if your God behaves worse than you, rapes, steals, murders, essentially like the other gods did, how can you ever try to emulate him? And I'm I'm not trying to say the Bible's perfect, and I'm not trying to say that I can justify every statement that appears in the Bible from an ethical perspective. But at least when it appeared on the scene, it gave humanity such a thrust forward ethically that now you have humanists and atheists claiming to be ethical and not believing in God when they basically grew up in a society that was entrenched in biblical values. So it behooves us, agnostics, atheists, deists, Jews, to at least pay tribute to the book that was the ethical well from where their values come from.
Can I ask a little bit about
between atheists and agnostics? I think agnostics would be capable of acknowledging that and paying tribute and being grateful, while an atheist is so angry and has a chip on the shoulder that he'll make silly statements like all this could have been developed by enough humanists in a room locked together. And
I think it depends on the atheist. I mean, I've talked to a lot of atheists, and I know who you're talking about. There is certainly a brand of, and unfortunately, like with anybody, the people who get the most screen time, unfortunately, tend to be the ones that say the most outrageous and upsetting things. So I get what you're saying. I think it does to some degree still depend on the atheist, though. I know I've known atheists that are very. I mean, like I say, I mean, I have identified as an atheist at some point, and I don't have any problem, having those discussions and acknowledging contributions of religion, certainly to society. I think that, I think it would be a mistake for anybody to say that like somehow religion manifests itself universally around the world in different forms, and that somehow didn't contribute to the evolution and the survival of our species, right? Like that didn't somehow help us get to where we are now. I think that would be a very, I'm agreeing with you. I think that would be a very ignorant, stance to take. Yeah.
That's a question. Would you say that a child who's introduced to biblical ethics fares a little better on this planet than a child who isn't?
Genuinely, that is such a complex, and there are so many aspects of that question. I don't know if I could honestly.
Try to generalize. What do you think? You instruct with the fear, with a healthy fear of God, versus what we see in the public school system, where they get you to question everything, even your own gender.
I'm going to say I think it's healthy to question everything, though. I do. I think that's healthy. I think God gave us, if we're coming at this from the perspective of like God created us, I think that in that
children.
I'm sorry.
For children to question everything, or adults.
I think both. I think it's good for people to have healthy skepticism. I think one of the examples that one of the examples that occurs to me is, we were taught as kids to always obey adults, to always follow what adults say. And I think that's a very dangerous thing and I understand that's not the same as thing as like believe in God, but I think that the idea of like, hey, obedience and doing what adults tell you is the right thing. I think that's a very dangerous thing to teach a child, because when you have an adult that has malicious intention for a child, suddenly the child doesn't have the skills to,
cases. I mean, I think your parent typically cares for you the most than some school teacher who is just giving you like a generic curricula.
It depends on the parent for sure. So I mean,
the vast majority of cases, right?
Hopefully,
cases.
I would hope so.
I think this is going to boil down to a right and left separation here. If you're saying that you think it's healthy for even children to question everything, I mean, I'm sure you acknowledge how malleable the minds of children are. Okay.
Sure.
Who should they trust more, a parent or an educator in the public school system? Who cares for them more? Right? Clearly the parent. Who should they trust more? Regardless, children aren't making up their mind about anything. They're choosing their poison. Whether it's the parent, which seems that this person has more to lose if the child goes down the wrong path, right? Or a system that it seems to be fighting against anything that tries to rule. I mean,
No, I get you. I agree with you. I think that the role in society of a parent to guide and to teach a child is, sure. I agree with you. I think that's established, and I think that's there are always situations where I think that's not the case, but I think like where parents don't have the best interest in their children's benefit. Like what's the Gypsy Rose? I don't know if you're familiar with the Gypsy Rose situation. Mother convinced her child that she had all these diseases her entire life. She had to she forced her to sit in a wheelchair when she didn't need to. She forced her to shave her head to pretend like she had cancer. And she's doing all this because she was getting payments from people on, on the internet to feel sympathy. She's basically using her child as a prop to get money. And so, and that's not not a single example either. I mean, there's parents who kill their children. There's parents who, do horrible, awful things. We just had somebody in my state who was arrested recently for duct taping their children's hands together and starving them. Like there are examples, and I think I think it's a footnote, but I think it's worth acknowledging that there are parents that definitely,
no, for sure,
whether intentionally or not intentionally, do not have their children's best intentions in mind. Yeah.
So they're clearly the exception, but they're not the rule.
Sure.
But back to the original question. Let's say we're dealing with the Jefferson Bible. So the reason I'm mentioning the Jefferson Bible is because of the deistic approach to religion, which is really the only way I try to communicate with atheists through. Put the revelation aside, put anything about supernatural powers. Let's focus on ethics and making the world a better place.
But what is the Jefferson Bible? I'm not familiar with it. So we use the King James Bible growing up. I'm not.
Well, the Jefferson Bible is essentially a King James Bible, like cutting out all the fluff. Anything that you, as an agnostic, cannot prove. Right?
Yeah.
That would you say that a child who's educated with the ethics in the Bible, what we call the Torah, would in some way not do better than a child who grew up with either, I don't know, Das Kapital, Plato's Republic, or any book from Sam Harris?
Yeah, I think probably Das Kapital and Sam Harris is probably going to be a little bit too complex for most young children to be able to comprehend. So I agree that's probably not the best reading material for especially a young child. But can I ask a question? Admittedly, you're the first.
You answer the question. I'm sorry.
No, I understand. I need to ask you a question though, because in order to understand kind of the framing of your question, and the reason I say that is because first of all, you're the first time. It's the first time I've ever had a conversation like this with somebody who would be described as somebody who subscribes to Judaism. And so I want to make sure that I understand exactly what is within that context. And the reason I ask is because when I have these conversations, I believe as a Jew, you subscribe to the Torah, which I believe is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Is that correct?
Correct.
So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And are those pretty similar between the Torah and, for example, if I had a King James version of the Bible and I read those 5 books in the King James version, are they pretty similar between the two? Do you know?
Yeah, no, they're pretty similar. But in terms of what's authoritative,
yeah,
it's specifically the commandments within the Torah, because the Torah has narrative, right? I mean, things that are descriptive and things that are prescriptive. Yeah. The Torah itself says that the actual words of God is what Moses received on Mount Sinai and continued receiving. But the reason I'm saying this and I'm making a distinction is because God focuses on behavior, not necessarily belief. The truth is, you're not going to keep many things if you don't believe it came from some sort of divine source, right? Sure. Just because at that point in time, these laws weren't tested yet. Nowadays, we could say, wow, people who do live by this ethical system, are like a net gain on this planet and not a net loss. But go ahead.
Yeah, because there are certainly things in those first 5 books that I would look at as probably not being in line with our current conception of morality. For example, we no longer stone children who are disobedient to their parents, right?
I agree.
And I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but there's certainly a number of things in those first 5 books that I wouldn't think would contribute to morality for a child. When we talk about sacking cities and killing everybody, man, woman, and child,
I agree.
There are certainly things in there that I just so I want to I want to understand. I want to kind of steel man your position and understand when you talk about the morality of the Torah or of the Bible, like what is it that you're referring to specifically?
Right. So when I talk about the morality of the Torah, especially when I'm speaking to someone who's not of my religion, I would never say it's perfect. I would never say it's flawless.
Yeah.
There are around 5 instances, 5 statements that we have to contend with. However, I would say someone who, in this case, is trying to reinvent the wheel ethically has to give a response to everything else, every other atrocity created by their pursuit of ethics without God, which is, the last 150 years has unalived over 180 million people. And that is specifically communist and left-wing pursuits.
So So you're kind of pitting Torah against essentially like left-wing politics is where you see the contention, is what you're saying.
Well, any fluid sense of ethics, the idea that we decide what's ethical. I'm just saying the Torah is better.
No, I gotcha. Are there genuine question? Are there leftist Jews? Like, would that be? 'Cause my understanding was that Judaism tends to lean more left, at least in the United States. I don't know, but yeah.
You're absolutely correct. The average Jew is not religious. I mean, Marx himself was Jewish.
Sure.
Christopher Hitchens, Carl Sagan.
I gotcha.
Like, they're Jewish legally, meaning according to Jewish law, if your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish. But that doesn't mean they're in a covenant with God, especially if they don't even believe in God. So yes, the average Jew is on the left and irreligious, unfortunately.
So I guess my question then is for you is so going back to your original question, is it better for a child to have this kind of religious teaching or not to have this religious teaching? Now that I kind of understand a little bit better what you're framing it against, what would you say are the highlights of this religious teaching? Like, what are we looking for in that? Because I've read the Old Testament. I've read it a few times. Admittedly, it's been probably a decade since I've read it. And I understand, like, there are, you've got the Ten Commandments, you've got, there are some interesting, admittedly, most of the stories that stick with me beyond, as far as like teaching morality are later in the Old Testament or are in the New Testament. But I'd love to maybe can you like share some highlights of what morality we get from the Old Testament, from the first 5 books specifically?
So there are around 613 laws
in
what Christians call the Old Testament. Half of those laws are ritualistic. Half of them deal with ethics. It's hard for people to really articulate where their values come from nowadays because they think that it's so ingrained in our society that we must have came up with them. These values, like honoring your parents, not favoring the poor man in judgment, not mistreating the widow, the orphan, the stranger. There's hundreds of these laws that are ingrained in our Bible. This is why we think it's normal. Sure. Every atheistic or agnostic individual out there should at least pay tribute to where those laws actually come from. I think if anyone would just read what people call the Old Testament straight through, highlighting these concepts, especially at the time when they first appeared on the scene, and they can appreciate the idea of an ethical God. Who cares about just a God who's all powerful? Anyone could claim that. But such a system of consistent ethics, that is what gets us to come to the conclusion that this book must have been divine, at least at that time. And not just divine, this divine author cared for us so much that he gave us a higher standard to aspire to. That is really where our religion should start and end. We're grateful to God, right? Because he cared for us first. I mean, it seems almost like the Christian idea, right? For God so loved the world, right? For us is that God so loved the world that he gave us a higher standard to aspire to. That's what the Torah is. And that's where I think if most Jews and Christians would articulate it like this, we'd win over a lot more believing individuals, because this they can relate to. Yes, I'm glad to live in a society that has been sensitized by these laws. Are there some laws there that I really wish were worded differently? I agree with you. Absolutely. There are probably like 5 or 6 statements in the Torah that ethically make no sense to me. Okay. That ethically, I could rationalize them from a different perspective, but I would only do that with someone who is already part of my philosophy. But someone, like yourself, who's not Jewish, I have to be honest and say, you know what? If I agree with a book 99% of the time, or even 95% of the time, this is a good book. Especially when it arose, it was a great book. That's enough to keep you religious and to keep your kids on an ethical trajectory.
I got you. Okay. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I appreciate the, appreciate the insights. Again, like, I think, I don't know, like, personally, the few times I've read through the Bible, through the Old Testament specifically, and specifically the 5 books that, we would, share as far as like, from a religious perspective, do I think there are, so I'm getting back to answering your question now, finally, because I know I kind of like dragged that on with a lot of, but I just want to make sure I was actually responding to your question. Your initial question was, is it better for a child to be exposed to that philosophy? And I can't remember, you said an or, is it better for that or, and I don't remember what the or was.
Well, there are many atheist Jews who put their kids in religious schools because they understand that there is good that could be gained for that. I mean, call it poor man's philosophy. It's teaching them ethics. They understand that it's better to teach this than essentially teach nothing. Even that example aside, people could even say regarding adults that cities that are more religious, let's say in the Bible Belt, commit less crime than those who are less religious, let's say in the Northeast or Northwest. That shows that people who try to live by some ethical standard live more ethical lives than those who don't.
So I would have to challenge that because I don't think that's true. I just Googled it because that wasn't my impression, and that wasn't my impression. So first thing when I Google which states commit the most crimes, first hit is from Southwest Journal, and it says you've got Alaska, New Mexico, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee.
No, cities.
You want to know cities?
Yeah. No, because I mean, states are typically a mixture. Florida,
Sure.
right? I mean, for example, is understood to be, I mean, somewhat of a red state.
Because you had said states, which is why I Googled states specifically. You said states that.
Oh,
right.
Did I say state? I'm sorry. I mean, I meant cities. The states are problematic, because they're a mixture. In terms of crimes, the blue cities in those states typically outweigh the crime that are performed in more red districts. So they, sort of unbalanced in terms of crime. And we see this in Florida. I mean, heck, even in New Jersey, in places where the city is relatively small, right? And that is the blue haven, while the majority of the state being red.
So according to Southwest Journal, again, St. Louis, Missouri is the highest crime rate in the U.S. And they have the top 20. So I'm just going to click on that article and I'll just see what they say in there. I'm sorry?
I'm trying to appeal to intuition instead of studies here. This is why I specifically mentioned the Bible Belt, because everyone can agree that people who live in such cities are typically more hospitable, more ethical than people who live in, let's say, Oregon, Seattle, Brooklyn, Manhattan.
I guess I wouldn't agree with that intuition, admittedly. I guess I wouldn't agree with that intuition. And that's part of why I wanted to defer to actual...
Why isn't... Do you really think, let's say, your car is safer in Nashville, Tennessee? And Nashville is a city, right? I mean, like a city that's, it's turning blue quite quickly. It's safer in Nashville, let's say, than in Portland, Oregon.
So I would have to look up property crime rates in
just use common sense. Studies aside, because a lot of these studies are skewed, or San Francisco or any city in California. I think, it's things in life, in terms even regarding studies, either confirm the obvious or are typically wrong. Okay.
So I know that, for example, so to your point, I guess, to the point that you're making, property crime rates in Washington and Oregon are higher than the national average, right? You have higher rates of both thefts and burglaries, anything relating to property. But for example, I live in Utah. I just moved to Utah, a red state, a very decidedly red state. And the trade-off we have here is we have higher rates of sexual and violent crime than you do in Washington or Oregon. So it's hard to say that one is across the board better than the other. You have higher rates of property crime in one, and you have higher rates of violent and sexual crime in the other.
So let me frame it a little differently.
Sure.
So you're in some unknown city, right?
Okay.
And you're walking down an alleyway.
Yeah.
And there's 5 guys walking towards you. I think that you would prefer them be returning from a Bible study than to be self-proclaimed atheists, correct?
I don't know. No, I don't know if I would agree with that. I think that I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying, but I don't know that I would actually have a specific preference. And would I have a preference of if they were coming back from a Bible study versus coming back from a Sikh religious gathering or from a Hindu religious gathering? I really don't know that I would have a preference. I think that you have
to some immovable standard.
I'm sorry.
The books.
I'm sorry.
People have an immovable, standard. Would they elevate their books so high that they've declared their latest book to be their last guru? And Hindus also. They're not coming from a system that tries to reinvent the wheel ethically. For example, in
at the same time though, if you look at
where they unalived 70 million people, and
sure,
They even had a standard. I mean, Mao's Red Book, but it was a standard written by men, and they acknowledged, how flimsy these laws were. If we don't have an ethical standard to aspire to, we typically end up being less ethical than those who do.
When we're just talking about like encountering a random person in the street, I follow somebody currently that does breakdowns on who is who essentially a breakdown on who is behind child molestations every week in the U.S. and they break down who they are, where they come from, what their background is, and a very large representation of those of people committing these crimes are actually Christian. They're related to somehow. They're involved in either preaching or in youth groups or in some way facilitating, a Christian. And I understand Christian is not the same as Judaism, but I'm just saying when you talk about like coming from a Bible study group, I don't think that necessitates that I'm going to trust that person more.
Because the majority. Wait, is it a large percentage or the majority?
No, it was a large percentage. I think it was.
So that's not the same. It's not the same. It's hard from. Okay, it's like saying a person who belongs to a system that tells them not to eat pork is in some way going to eat pork more than someone who's allowed to eat whatever they want to eat. I mean, it seems a little silly.
Can you say that again? Sorry.
It's like saying that someone who belongs to a system that prohibits the eating of pork, at the end of the day, is going to end up eating more pork than a person who doesn't have this as a standard in their life. This is why things in life either confirm the obvious or are typically wrong. There's a whole book called Lying with Statistics. And most of these, this is why that when someone quotes a statistic, and to the left, essentially quoting a statistic is equivalent to us like reading a passage that starts with "Thus says the Lord." It's an easy way to lie to the masses.
I got you. No, in part, I think, and it's funny because a lot of what you're saying, I always agree in part, but I agree that like certainly numbers can be used to deceive people. Certainly statistics can be used to deceive people. Absolutely, 100%. And one of your spectators here kind of called me out as a leftist, and just to be transparent, I do. I tend to subscribe more to leftist ideology. I'm not trying to hide that. I'm not trying to.
Why is that though? I mean, why can't you be, supporting these ideas and be on the right?
For me, left and right is not so much about religion. It's more about where we concentrate power. And I think there's a concern for me that power is being concentrated at a corporate level at the cost of workers, at the cost of people who are coming in and putting in their work and trying to raise their families and trying to build the actual communities that we live in. And that's very concerning to me. I think that I don't think that GDP is a good measure of the success that we have as a country. I don't think that corporate success or corporate welfare is as high of a priority as building strong families and building strong communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's typically not the leftist approach. You imagine a bigger corporation nowadays in the federal government, and the left is always for big government.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I don't think that. I guess in the groups I run, it might be a little bit different. I don't know. Certainly left and right are large. That's a large umbrella. There's lots of different people saying lots of different things. There's lots of people who describe themselves as leftists that I disagree with, like flat out. There's a lot of what they say that I push back on, and I say like, hey, a lot of what you're saying is giving these ideals that I believe in a bad name, and I push back on leftists too. Like it's not. I certainly don't consider people on the left a monolith. Yeah.
So it's essentially, in my opinion, good ideas versus bad ideas.
Maybe he's a classical liberal.
Okay. It's essentially good ideas versus bad ideas. Like use the phrase religious right. People on the right who are typically religious have better ideas than those on the left who I think try to reinvent the wheel ethically. So from that perspective, I would trust someone from the right over someone from the left. Although I'm sure there are beautiful people on the left and there are crappy people on the right. There are beautiful atheists and there are crappy religious people. However, in the vast majority of cases, I think they're trying to reinstitute COVID lockdowns again. These are typically not people on the right. It's typically coming from people who claim to be science and fact based, when I'm pretty sure now it's pretty obvious that these masks don't really work. It seems that religious people have to deal enough with the irrational in our books that we're able to think clearly in civil society. While if you don't have a religion, one develops one essentially out of nothing, and will take a long time to in some way try to recreate the successes that the right has, because we belong to a time-tested institution, i.e. the Bible. So even from that perspective alone, it benefits us to trust religious people more than leftists, right?
I got you. I got you. Look, I don't fault you for holding that position. I think that the position you're holding, I think it's I'm not here to say that you're a grifter. We obviously disagree, and I think that's okay. I actually am with you, though. I'm against more COVID lockdowns. I think that COVID lockdowns had tremendous negative impacts on society. I think that we lost a lot of small business. I think that a lot of children lost opportunities in education. I think that there's a lot of communities that were hurt by it. I think there was a lot of I think there were a lot of negative, whether they were intended or not. There were a lot of negative consequences to having a forced lockdown. I'm with you on being against more COVID lockdowns. But yeah, and I just say that to say, like, when we talk about like left versus right, there are people on the left that I think that we would find more common ground on than we would necessarily need to like disagree on every point. I agree with a lot of things you're saying. I also disagree with some of the things you're saying. But yeah, truly no bad sentiment from me for the things you're saying. I think we have different perspectives, and I think that's okay.
The God that you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. And the religious person that you dislike, I also dislike. So I think this is why we're kindred spirits. I mean, from this perspective. I mean, I think there's a lot of silly ideas pushed in the name of religion.
Sure.
And I try to ground religious people a little more, just to help them articulate where their values come from, just because I think they're hurting the world more than helping it by making religion seem so illogical, when the Bible itself is, I mean, it's pretty clear. You know, well, did you know that in the Jewish Bible, heaven and hell doesn't appear? The devil doesn't appear? Like, all these things are later concepts, later developed ideas that, of course, an atheist is going to...
He hasn't even got into the fact that the Mashiach doesn't even appear.
Right. Well, so the notion of the Messiah...
I didn't hear that. Sorry, what doesn't appear?
Mashiach. You know, so Mashiach is Hebrew for Messiah.
Gotcha. Okay.
The notion of the Messiah doesn't literally appear in the Jewish Bible. Although, I mean, it's essentially a Jewish idea. There's a lot of these ideas that are later developed ideas that people in some way toss the Bible away because of, right? Like, instead of actually understanding the message of the Bible as it was intended to, right? An ethical message given over to an agrarian society, a very practical agrarian society. People nowadays, you know, with these notions, deathbed confessions, you know, I don't know, with demonic possessions, all these things, you know, hurt religion, and it hurts thinking people, inquisitive college kids who ultimately are looking for an ethical outlet in their life, and all they're given, you know, is doomsday blood on the cross. You know, this is one, I'm not a Christian, but there are Jews who teach religion from this perspective, and I think that it just draws people who would have come anyways, and not those who actually have the capacity to make a change in this world. People who are, you know, devoted to ethics, devoted to leaving this world a little better than they found it, but they're not being equipped with the proper tools. God equipped us with those tools, with the instructions that appear in the Torah. This is my religious side talking. I believe that if we keep these laws, the world would improve. Okay, that's it. That's my whole argument.
Love it. No, I love it. I think that's great. I have no problem with that. And truly, I appreciate you sharing your views on religion. Like I said, it's the first time I've talked to somebody that subscribes to Judaism, and I think that I don't have anything critical or anything to say back. Just I appreciate the shared insights.
Okay, man. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Take care.